So it's May 3rd, 2021 in Hillsborough, North Carolina, and we are reading the last verse of 10th Canto, chapter 24. It's text 38. Ityadrigo dvijamakam Vasudeva prachoditaha Yata vidhayate gopa Saha Krishna vrajamnyayu. Iti, in this manner, Adri, to Govardhan Hill, go the cows, Dvija, and the Brahmanas, Makam, the great sacrifice, Vasudeva, by Lord Krishna, Prachoditaha, urged, Yata, properly, Vidhaya, executing, Te, they, Gopaha, the cowherds, Saha Krishna, together with Lord Krishna, Vrajam, to Vraja, Yayahu, they went. BBT translation. The members of the cowherd community, having been thus inspired by Lord Vasudeva to properly execute the sacrifice to Govardhan Hill, the cows and the Brahmanas, returned with Lord Krishna to their village, Vraja. BBT purport. Although the Govardhan Puja was performed in a blissful and successful way, the matter was hardly finished. Lord Indra is, after all, tremendously powerful, and he received the news of the Govardhan sacrifice with burning anger. What ensued will be described in the following chapter. So what makes some people jubilantly happy makes other people burningly angry. Thus end the purports of the humble servants of His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, to the 10th Canto, 24th chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam, entitled Worshipping Govardhan Hill. Ichadrigo dvijama kam vasudeva prachoditaha yata vidhayate gopa saha Krishna vrajamnyayu. The members of the cowherd community, having thus been inspired by Lord Vasudeva to properly execute the sacrifice to Govardhan Hill, the cows and the Brahmanas returned with Lord Krishna to their village, Raja. All right, we're going to look at Jiva Goswami's commentary, which is Sanatana Goswami just repeated it, so we're just going to read Jiva Goswami's. The cowherds were inspired by Vasudeva, the superintendent of all beings. So which part of this verse says that they were, without looking at the translation, just as Sanskrit, which part says they were inspired by Vasudeva? Prayojita. Okay. Does that word look a little familiar to anybody? Yes, it should. This indicates that they surpassed the directives given and thus satisfied the soul of all beings. They performed the sacrifice properly, yata, because they could not give up association with Krishna because of the arousal of great affection. They returned with him to Vraja, which was situated a little over a krosha from Radhakunda on the northeast corner of Govardhan. By citing Karmavada to negate worship of devatas, Krishna established the predominance of action. Right? Everybody remember that? How action, Krishna was preaching that action is important. We should worship work. Okay, so now please listen carefully, because Jiva Goswami is going to relate Vasudeva Prayoditaha, the inspiration of Vasudeva, to the concept of action as given in the Bhagavad-Gita, especially Bhagavad-Gita 18:18. By previous impressions, one develops a tendency to perform actions. Thus, being fixed in actions is based on the root of actions, impressions. Then, inspired by Antaryami, who's Antaryami? Supersoul. Yes, okay. According to the impressions, a person performs actions. Okay, so can anyone explain this back to me? Yes, according to your sankalpa, your determination, and your samskaras, your impressions, Antaryami, the super soul in the heart, will give inspiration to do a certain karma, to do a certain action. Thus, the power of action alone is rejected. So by saying Vasudeva Prayojitaha, that you're inspired by Vasudeva, it's reminding us that action in and of itself, if you try to just isolate action, it doesn't work. By one's nature in the gunas such as sattva, one can accomplish livelihood. Since there is effort necessary to attain one's objectives, action should never be omitted. So it's not that you don't do action, but it's not the whole thing. You have to have the whole picture. It was stated that one must worship one's means of livelihood, which provides sustenance and maintenance. Thus, predominance of karma action was emphasized. And the purpose of these unlimited actions is one's bhakti. So here we have another important point, that whatever we're doing in our livelihood, the purpose of that is bhakti. The main characteristic of the excellence of bhakti is worship of the devotee. Thus, Govardhana should be worshipped. That is the conclusion. So how Jiva Goswami is taking Krishna's philosophy of work, adding it with this Vasudeva Prachoditaha, and explaining how under the impetus, the inspiration given by Krishna, according to one's sankalpas, samskaras, one will engage in action. That action should be done for one's livelihood, but that should be part of bhakti. The intention of Krishna was as follows. I, who am the Supreme Lord, have taken the form of their son. Who else is their Lord, and who are these devatas? Now listen to this carefully. Their inspiration for action is simply their nature filled with prema for me. So that's the inspiration for the pure devotees. It's not based on some mundane sanskaras. Non-acceptance of devatas in my human pastimes will bring them closer to me. But in order to protect the human pastimes, I am not eager to promote this. So we talked about this before, that Krishna is not trying to promote himself as God to the Vrijbasis. So he's not going to just say to them, well, don't worship the demigods, worship me. So instead, he talks about action. Thus, I will accomplish my purpose by making them understand through the teachings of atheistic Mimamsa Sankavada. This thinking should be understood in other places as well, where Krishna preaches other philosophies. All right, so I wanted to look at what is inspiration, and I would suggest that sometime today you Google on inspiration Sariputta, and you will find an old Back to Godhead article where my late godbrother Sariputta Prabhu wrote about what is the nature of inspiration. On inspiration, if you Google on inspiration Sariputta, you will go to that old Back to Godhead article. And I'm not able in the time allotted to get all the points of it. But his main thrust is that when we understand something, when we understand what to do, it's not just through our own actions, as Jiva Goswami is saying here. It's not just that I work hard, and then I know what to do. There's something else involved. So we're going to look at the point Sariputta Prabhu makes about mundane inspiration. Then we're going to go to Jiva Goswami's referencing Gita 18:18, and then we're going to look at the inspiration of these Vrajvasis. So Sariputta Prabhu is giving a lot of examples from science, mathematics, and art of very famous people who worked very hard for a long time to come up with solutions, and then suddenly got an inspiration and they knew what to do, right? He gives the famous example, of course, of Archimedes, who jumped out of his bathtub saying, Eureka, Eureka. But there's many, many other examples as well. And some examples of people who received sudden inspiration without having previously worked hard at all. And he gives the example of Mozart, who said, if I'm in a good mood and walking in nature, all of a sudden the whole symphony comes to me as a complete whole. And I'm sure we've all had experience of this kind of thing, where all of a sudden we just understand something. Yes? Who here has had that kind of experience? Now, sometimes, again, it's after we do a lot of work, and sometimes it's without having done a lot of work. And the most dramatic experience for me with this was when I was working on writing the Learn to Read books, which look like very simple books, but they're not. Each book has to have certain words in it and cannot have any other kinds of words in it. It has to have words that follow a particular pattern, and it cannot have any other words. I mean, an example of how difficult this is we're teaching making the long U sound with U consonant E. And so I mistakenly put in the word huge without realizing that with huge, the G is also making the soft J sound because it's being followed by E. And we hadn't taught that yet. And so I had that in an early version, and then I had to take it out. It doesn't fit. And then we also had about 15 criteria for each book, how long the sentences could be, how many sentences on a page, the type of the font, the size of the font, the relationship of the picture to the text, what kind of sentences you could have, complex, compound, simple, declarative questions, so forth, the sort of intellectual concepts that you could have, how many sentences could be in the story altogether. It was an extremely complicated thing. And then the stories had to be interesting. And they had to have a beginning, middle, and end. And they had to have a climax. And as I was told by Beverly Randall of Nelson Thorne's PM Publishing, they had to have children as the heroes, not adults as the heroes. And then, of course, they had to have something to do with Krishna. So it was extremely complicated and difficult. And I would be working for days and days and days and days. And I'd work for a while, and then I'd go and chant japa for a while, and then I'd work for a while, and then I'd chant some more, and I'd work for a while, and I would fail, and I would fail, and I would fail, and I would fail, and I would fail. And then all of a sudden, it would come. And this happened over and over and over and over. And I would work until I couldn't work anymore. And then I would say the sloka that Bhima said to Krishna when he couldn't kill Jarasandha after 28 days. No shaktoham jarasandham nirjetam yudimadava. I don't have the Shakti to kill Jarasandha. Apyayam swena tejasa. Then Krishna gave his tejasa, his potency, to Bhima and a little hint by tearing the ground. Anyway, then I would get it. 2 of the books came to me without any effort on my part at all. So there was one book, I hadn't even started yet, and I was in the temple room in Auckland in the morning chanting japa, and all of a sudden at 6 o'clock in the morning, the whole book was in my mind at once. That was A Chicken is Food for a Cat. And which is the one book we get criticized on by the meat eaters because it pushes vegetarianism. But that one, I think Krishna wrote that book. I didn't write it. And the other one was 7 Things for Krishna, where the first time I sat at my computer to write it, the book just wrote itself. I didn't even know where it was going, and there it wrote itself. And every time I read that book, I cry. I just remember how Krishna just wrote it. So sometimes inspiration happens like that, right? Sometimes we work really, really hard, and it's just, I give up, Krishna. I can't do it. I can't figure it out. And then it's there. And other times we don't even do any work, and just it's there. So Sariputta has 2 characteristics of this inspiration: that the source lies beyond the subject's conscious perception. We don't know where this comes from. And that it provides the subject with info unattainable by any conscious effort. And generally, inspiration comes as a package. You see the whole thing, right? Again, he gives many examples in math and science and art. So the materialists try to explain that we have some kind of mechanistic process in the brain where somewhere in the subconscious is doing this incredible calculation of all the possible solutions without our conscious knowledge. And then when the time is right, the subconscious knocks on the door of the conscious and says, hey, I figured it out. Here it is. And Sariputta Prabhu explains, as you know, he was a mathematician, how this is mathematically so improbable as to be impossible. That the number of possible solutions to our situation, especially highly complex things. Now, he gives examples of mathematicians who came up with final solutions that required proofs that involved things that weren't yet known at their time. So how could their subconscious have come up with this? Right? And he also gives the example in science, and I found this very interesting, that, we have this idea, we're taught in school, that the way science works is I observe, and from my observation, I come up with a hypothesis, and then I test my hypothesis. But he was saying, how do we come up with that hypothesis? One of the 6 objections to empiricism is that there's an infinite number of stories to explain any set of facts. So how do we come up with this particular story to explain the facts? Or in math, how do you come up with the a priori assumptions? And he says this is also inspiration. So where does this inspiration come from? I find it one of the most wonderful aspects of the Vedic philosophy, and particularly our Vaishnava philosophy, and particularly our Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy, that we not only explain the transcendence, but we also explain the world. A spiritual philosophy that only explains the spiritual and doesn't explain the world of our everyday experience is very incomplete. The same with a philosophy that doesn't explain how to live socially, which is what Jiva Goswami is tying in here, because Krishna is talking about livelihood. So Krishna also explains, of course, as Srila Prabhupada says in a very summary way in the Bhagavad-Gita, how the world works, especially in chapters 13 through 18. Of course, this is explained in much more detail in the 2nd and 3rd cantos, particularly of the Srimad Bhagavatam. How does the world work? And these are subjects that I know from having taken such a class in UNC Chapel Hill, the doctoral level, which was the philosophy of research, that the materialists haven't figured out at all. Why do we do anything? Where do we get these inspirations? Where do we get our motivations for action? Where do we get inspired with an idea? Where do we get our sankalpas from? What does it come from? What's driving us? What's motivating us? They haven't a clue. So in the Bhagavad-Gita 18:18, Krishna says, Jnanam Gayam Prignata Trivida Karma Chodana. Karma Chodana. So chodana, which is, again, a very similar word, is what is the inspiration for work? Why do we do what we do? Well, it's the action itself, yes, but it is also the inspiration for the action is myself, my goal, and what I know. And the what I know part is being given by God. Just like Krishna also talks about the 5 factors of action, and one of them is the Lord. I mean, without that, I can't even remember all of my desires, and I can't even remember all of my impressions. In fact, some of this is even from past lives, that we had some desire in a past life. We wanted vengeance on an enemy, and Krishna says, there's your enemy, marry her and get vengeance. That is exactly what he does. Or hire him and get vengeance. You'll have your opportunity. Or, oh, you wanted to do good for this person in another life. Marry them and help them. Give birth to them and help them. There they are. There they are. Here's your opportunity to do what you wanted to do. So Krishna is giving us that kind of inspiration. Now, the kind of inspiration we want is the kind of inspiration Jiva Goswami is talking about here, an inspiration in bhakti. Yes? I mean, everybody asks this question wherever you go in the world. How do I know what to do to advance? What's the best thing I can do? We had a session on the holy name a couple days ago, and it was one of the questions. What can I do to improve my japa? Or what can I do to make more progress? Or people were asking me yesterday, what can I do with my teenagers? So this is what we want to know. is how to get this inspiration. And I was thinking a lot about the Gayatri mantras, especially because we recently wrote this paper on the Brahma Gayatri, right? And we're asking at the end of the Brahma Gayatri, I meditate on he who gives us enthusiasm, right? Prachodayat, it's practically speaking the same word. You know, if we look at the Brahma Gayatri, the first part is Sambandha, that beyond the material universe and beyond, it can also be explained as the gross and subtle body, is the all-effulgent one who can be understood as Surya Narayan or Lord Chaitanya or as Krishna. I meditate on his Shakti, I meditate on his effulgence, which can be understood as the light of the sun or Srimati Radharani, which is Abhideya. What do? I meditate on that. And then the Lord and the Lord's energy inspires me and enthuses me and directs me. And that's why this mantra had to be learned and chanted before one could study the scriptures in Vedic times. One was not allowed to touch the scriptures unless one had received this mantra. Why? Because otherwise one may go to the scriptures with some mundane conception, and one may impose one's mundane conception upon the scriptures. One may misuse the scriptures. But by meditating on this mantra received in obedience to a guru who determines, interestingly enough, you have to be at least to a great extent in sattva guna even to be able to chant this mantra, that then you receive divine inspiration. You know, Archimedes wants to know how to figure out a gold crown, and Mozart wants to know how to write a symphony, but we want to know how to approach Krishna. So we have this meditation. And of course, the mantras Prabhupada gave us, we also ask for inspiration from Guru, and we also ask for inspiration from Lord Chaitanya. Of course, the last verse, which Prabhupada describes a lot, and he writes out the whole verse in Chaitanya Charitamrita Madhya Lila 8:138. That's interesting because there we're meditating on Krishna being enthused by his Madhurya Bhav. What enthuses Krishna? What inspires Krishna? That's a whole other topic, which we will not touch on today. But this concept that we are being inspired by the Lord and that we recognize it. The difference between the devotee and the non-devotee is we recognize that I am wholly dependent on the Lord for inspiration and guidance. I can have my desire, I can have my goal, I can have my impressions, I can do my action, but without the inspiration of the Lord, I don't accomplish anything. And this is our acknowledgement. And this is one of the ways that one of the 6 symptoms of surrender is described. So there's different translations of the 6 symptoms of surrender, which, by the way, are understood by all the followers of the Vedas. It's not simply we Gaudiyas who talk about the 6 symptoms of surrender and the necessity of surrender. In fact, the Sri Vaishnavas put a lot more emphasis on this surrender, Sharanagati, than we do. But one of the 6 symptoms of surrender can be defined as knowing that one is not independent in fulfilling one's desires, that we are dependent on the direction and the inspiration from the Lord. So Jiva Goswami says, what do the residents of Vraja desire? Their inspiration is they have a nature filled with prema for Krishna. What they're desiring is, I want to love Krishna more. I want to love Krishna more. I want to love Krishna more. And how funny this is, because instead of Krishna saying to them, oh, you want to love me more? Let me inspire you with worshiping me instead of Indra. I mean, that's what he might do for people like me. But for the Vrajvasis, they don't have a sense that Krishna is God. Generally, sometimes they remember a little bit, like the gopis looking for Krishna who say, we know you're not the son of Mother Yasoda. We know you're the Antaryami, you're the indwelling witness in everyone's heart. We know who you are. So they know, sort of, ish, as they say today, no ish, that Krishna is God. But that's not their meditation, and it's actually a disturbance, right? Mother Yasoda sees the universal form. Oh. And Krishna goes, nope, I'm your son. Yeah. So Krishna, instead of saying, worship me instead of worshiping Indra, he says, just worship your work. And Govardhan, and worship Govardhan, who is Krishna. So he inspires them in that way. And the interesting usefulness of this for people like me in this world at this time is that we can have our livelihood as inspiration for bhakti. So I got asked this by these devotees yesterday who were asking me how to inspire their teenagers. And they have one who's about to go to college. And first they're talking about how he's interested in girls and he wants to get married, but they want to make sure he has his education and career down first. Okay. And then they say, should we encourage him in career or should we encourage him just to do full-time bhakti? And I'm like, okay, this is an odd question. I said, you already said that he wants to get married and you want him to have a career, and then you don't know whether or not to encourage him in having a career. And I said, the whole essence of the Bhagavad-Gita can be understood as your career can be part of your bhakti. I said, do you have bhakti infused in your career? I asked each of them. And they were like, yeah, I do. As much as I can. Now you might say, well, that's easy for Nanda Maharaj, Mother Yasoda, to have their career infused with bhakti. When Mother Yasoda is preparing the milk products, she's singing songs about Krishna, and Nanda Maharaj is taking care of cows, thinking, my son will take over and he'll take care of the cows, and we're having the milk is being given for Krishna. And, you know, Krishna's right there. But Krishna's right here too. Right? It's just Nectar Devotion. Prabhupada is talking about how the way we get free from material life is by worshiping the deity he set at home, interestingly enough. Making the deity the center of your home. I'm working for Krishna. How am I acting in bhakti in my work? You know, I always like to look at Bhagavad-Gita 12, 13 through 20. When it was a kind friend to all living entities. Right? One who's free from happiness and distress, fame and infamy, honor and dishonor. I think Krishna says free from happiness and distress like 4 times in those verses. Who doesn't give any anxiety to others. And that's one of the angas of bhakti, not to give anxiety to others. It's one of the angas of bhakti to be equipoised in happiness and distress. And the lady was saying to me, yeah, you know, I actually do practice that at work. And other people at work say, how do you remain equipoised in all these difficulties? That, as Jiva Goswami is saying, through our livelihood, we can also develop bhakti. Through our livelihood, we can also develop bhakti. Through everything we're doing, Krishna says to Uddhava, both through the injunctions of actions based on Shastra and through ordinary work, one should be worshiping the Lord. And if we say, I don't know how to do that, well, we have the instructions of the Shastra, but you know what else we have? Inspiration. Na shaktoham jarasandam nirjetam yudimadava. I don't know how to do. I don't know how to spiritualize my work. I don't know how to spiritualize my family. I don't know how to do it. Krishna, help me. Show me. Show me how to serve you. Mama nusram yujicha. How do I remember you while I'm shooting arrows? Show me. Inspire me. And because that's what he wants us to do, to see him everywhere and think of him everywhere and dedicate everything to him, why will he not? If he's inspiring, you know, Archimedes and Mozart with their things in the world, why will he not inspire his devotees? Maharaj, you have something to add. Anybody? Anything to add? To breathe in. Oh. I really like that Drista Prabhu, inspiration for those who are listening. Drista Prabhu is saying inspiration means to breathe in. And Krishna's everywhere. In fact, Krishna says, I join with the air of life. Yes? 15th chapter. And Arjuna, seeing the Vishwarupa, says, you are air. Yes. Mm. I wish I had time to repeat the whole thing you said because it was so dramatically beautiful. And that is a lot of what Krishna talks about in the Bhagavad-Gita. To Arjuna, who he's telling, hey, go do your career, buddy. Krishna consciousness isn't walking away. If you want to do that, Arjuna, sure. Sit on deerskin, go to a secluded place, forget about Draupadi, Subhadra, Yudhisthira, the kingdom, and, look at the tip of your nose. And Arjuna goes, Chanchalahima, not Krishna, I can't do that. And then Krishna says, okay, then. Fight as a service. Do your royal duty as a service. And that's what he's talking about, right? Pandita Samadarshina, yes. Thank you. Yes, Marsh. And then immediately said, okay, I'll go do it. Right. Maharaj is saying when Prabhupada told Tamal Krishna Maharaj to go to China, and Tamal Krishna Maharaj said he didn't want to do it. And then Prabhupada said, okay, just do nothing and sit and chat. That's exactly what Krishna did to Arjuna. He said, fine. Because Arjuna kept arguing with him, You could see Arjuna's bringing up these arguments, especially in the 4th chapter, the 5th chapter. He's like, why do you want me to do this? Okay, fine. God, fine. You don't want to fight? You want to meditate? Fine. Here's what you do. Stare at your nose. Be a brahmachari. Raise your life air. Live in the forest. Right? And Arjuna says, this sounds really impractical to me. What happens to all the people who fail on this method? Srila Prabhupada ki jai.